Wrath and Glory focuses primarily within a sector known as the Gilead System, a smallish system cut off from the rest of the Imperium by the Warp. This guide is designed as a primer into the Gilead System timeline and a brief overview of its various settings. Then I go over the current adventure paths and where they are set as a handy reference. First, a little history. I plotted out a rough timeline of events, with corresponding major events that took place at the time as milestones to help give you an idea of what happened and when. .798.M30 to 005.M31, the Great Crusade. The Gilead System is hypothesized to have been first colonized during the Great Crusade, when the Emperor of Mankind himself led humanity across the stars in conquest. Back then, it wasn't anything remarkable as a system, and was simply designated the title SKN-71 L-009, and its sun was designated NNE-59021. 005 to 014-M31, the Horus Heresy. When the events of the Horus Heresy took place, the system was left mostly forgotten about, with little importance, if any, falling into relative obscurity alongside countless other systems during the Age of Darkness. 092.M32, the Age of the Imperium. Eventually though, sometime around M32, an explorator fleet named Soroka of the Mechanicum of Mars claimed a barren planet closest to the system's sun and named it Avacarus. Non-imperial human societies were consequently discovered on a neighbouring fertile planet of Ostia and the surprisingly industrial world of Primus. Recolonisation efforts were put in place, and the system's inhabitants, while mostly acting compliant, had a few native sects that were at first resistant, and uprisings were not uncommon amongst the populace. Meanwhile, the tech priests of the former explorator fleet had discovered and consequently hidden evidence of advanced human technology and peculiar Xenos ruins dotted about the system's planets and moons. M34 Nova Terra Interregnum. In the millennia that followed, the system fell into relative obscurity, eventually being visited by heretics and even corrupted Astartes. In M34, there were a huge effort led by military to purge and reclaim the system once and for all. This crusade, named the Gilead Crusade after its leader, Saint Juliana Gilead, was an overwhelming success, and for almost 6 millennia the system, now called Gilead in the saint's honour, remained a defiant and proud outpost of loyal imperial citizens. 999.M41 Noctis Aeterna. In the wake of the fall of Cadia in the 13th Black Crusade, reality tore itself apart from the Hadex anomaly at the core of Jericho Reach in the Eastern Fringe all the way to the furthest star system of the Segmentum Obscurus in the galactic west, cutting off the galactic north entirely from Terra. The Great Rift, or Cicatrix Maledictum, was born. This period of time has come to be known as Noctis Aeterna, or the Blackness, and made warp travel all but impossible, isolating a lot of the planets of the Imperium, including the Gilead System. With the Gilead System cut off from the rest of the Imperium, no one could leave or enter, and it remained this way for 3 years. At least 3 years relative to the inhabitants of the Gilead System, for due to the vast influx of warp energies, time in large areas of real space can pass strangely, speeding up in some or slowing in others in comparison to the time experienced on Terra. Eventually, the fluctuations of time and indeed stability of real space in general began to return to somewhat normality, though Imperium Nihilus, the area to the north of the rift where Gilead can be found, remained largely isolated and cut off from the Imperium Sanctus. 002.M42 Varonius' arrival. Eventually, a rogue trader known as Jacko Varonius braved the warp to punch through the Cicatrix Maledictum to arrive in the Gilead System. The journey proved so perilous and treacherous that only a third of Varonius' flotilla survived the slightly more stable but still dangerous gauntlet, eventually named the Straits of Andrast after the first of the ships to make it through the warp in this sector. Varonius' arrival was both loathed and welcomed. Welcomed as a reminder that the Imperium had not forgotten the system, but loathed by those who were reluctant to relinquish any authority to him by his warrant of trade and his charismatic influence. Ultimately though, Gilead remains isolated. The arrival of Varonius and his flotilla is seen as a miracle, and to try and return through the Straits of Andrast, madness. It's at this point in time that the Gilead System currently sits. While I'll individually introduce each planet in the Gilead system, there will be future videos where I will cover them in much greater detail. Let's take a look at the Gilead system in general. In the grand map of the galaxy, the Gilead system can be located in a coreward region near the border of the Segmentum Solar and the Segmentum Obscurus. The system itself comprises of one star named Convenir, 8 planets, 5 of which are deemed the Heart Worlds, 1 classified as part of the Reach, and 2 called Membrane Worlds. The following information is taken primarily from the core rulebook and the Forsaken System Player's Guide, and I encourage you to read the former to get an even more in-depth understanding of each planet and their moons. Avacharis. Avacharis is a forge world with a population of around 10 billion. This forge world planet sits closest to the system's star, and its geography is described as a lifeless tundra blasted with unsurvivable heat in its dayside and frozen into poisonous crystalscapes at night. It's a barren rock of vast material wealth and toxic clouds of corrosive acid rain, locked into a close orbit with its star. The sheer gravity of the planet keeps its dayside permanently facing the sun, rendering one side so permanently hot that it renders simple metals to molten slag in a matter of seconds. The other side consequently remains locked in a perpetual icy night. Because of this, the billions of inhabitants survive and toil underground in foundry forges topped with sheaths of iron. These forge structures sprawl deep underground, and amongst some of them are older structures even more, called the Eternal Engines. These relics of Dark Age technology have been since repurposed by the Cult Mechanicus that live there, old and empty fortresses previously occupied by the Legio Korthos, who have long since been deployed across the galaxy, dot some of the landscape. Avacharis is adorned with an orbital ring structure comprised of shipyards and space docks, used for transporting and docking goods to and from the planet. It has 2 moons, the silvery, icy moon of Odo and the black-rocked Uru, both of which have long since been exhausted of resources and only hollow shells remain, leaving them perfect havens for pirates and corsairs. Nethrius. Nethrius, the second planet from the system's star, is a death world turned night world. Described as a tectonic nightmare of a world, it's comprised of volcanic wastelands that continuously undergo tectonic unrest. Fire, fumes and ash constantly spill into the sky, and void-shielded fortress cities known as dominions shield the populace of 10 million from the harsh conditions and the mega flora and fauna that roam and rampage here. It's within these cities that the inhabitants cultivate the only known native vegetation, a hardy breed of tuber known by the local populace as worldroot. The barons of the Acastan League produce knights here that end up testing against and defending against the planet's megafauna, in particular a gigantic drill-headed chitinous monstrosity called a boreworm. Anti-grav land trains and lines of sky freighters connect to each fortress city carrying resources and materials. There's also a land train system, vast macro haulers that place a track of adamantium before it and then removes it as it passes. This is used because the planet is susceptible to violent ash storms and volcanic discharges that can threaten aerial transit. These gigantic trains act as a miniature dominion in themselves, protected by their crews who see them as home. Ostia. Ostia is an agri-world holding the population of approximately 9 billion people. The climate is varied but very temperate, not that dissimilar to pre-imperial ancient Terra, which makes it absolutely perfect for growing produce. Described as a green jewel in the Gilead Void, Ostia is home to fields, oceans and even forests. This world is the main producer of crops and sustenance for the inhabitants of the Gilead system as a whole, and a majority of which is taken to the huge populations of Gilead Primus. Because of its importance, Ostia is surrounded by a network of defensive satellites, orbital batteries, and space stations that have been dubbed the Crown of Blades, bearing enough firepower to turn or destroy any attack fleet with the gall or stupidity enough to attempt an attack. Crops and their biomes are varied and plentiful, but the lives of many Ostian are bleak in contrast. This is because the demand for produce and food has exponentially grown since the system was cut off from the rest of the Imperium. This leaves a lot of the workers and harvesters all but starving as rationing gets tighter and tighter. Amongst the biomes and fields lie ancient ruins of a long-gone empire. These ruins and structures are made of wraithbone, covered in Eldari rooms and moss and creepers. The superstitious natives avoid these structures and consider them haunted or cursed. Enoch. The fourth planet from the Gilead star, Enoch, or Holy Enoch, is a shrine world mostly covered in water, with equatorial regions housing habitable deserts and the polar regions being ice-covered tundra. It officially houses 1 billion people, though ad hoc census estimates this to be closer to 2 billion. Enoch lacks an axial tilt, meaning that it has no seasons, and it has a single huge moon that imparts powerful tides across the continents and islands. Enoch was once fairly peaceful, becoming a planet where pilgrims and visitors would spend a life dedicated to the Imperial Creed. The ocean world teemed with edible flora in its reefs, and small archipelagos and land masses dotting its equatorial span. Monasteries and cathedrals were erected across the planet, housing litanies, statues and relics of saints and heroes, and it attracted pilgrims from all across the galaxy. However, when the Cicatrix Maledictum ripped the galaxy in half and isolated the Gilead System, millions of pilgrims remained stranded on Enoch, causing an unprecedented overpopulation. Food and resources became scarce, and violence erupted amongst them, whilst their stranded civilian ships became easy prey for Xenos raiders above the skies. For now, the more wealthy and high-ranked of nobles remain holed up in their bastions, with the main populace below fighting and rioting for food. The Sisters of Battle and Enforcers police the streets as best they can, and the Absolvers, the local chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, have a station here, as do the Death Watch in the Polar North. Gilead Primus. Gilead Primus is the fifth and final heartworld in the Gilead System. Housing a populace of approximately 16 billion, its world classification is that of a hive world. Geographically, the planet is primary arid wasteland, red rock plains and lifeless alkali flats. Huge scars are carved out of the crimson deserts made by aggressive strip mining, and towering, multi-kilometre tall hive cities break through the skies. A few remaining mining towns, outposts and way stations dot the landscape, but these are abandoned. Long extinct carnosaur skeletons scatter the wasteland, some of which seem to dwarf the current megafauna of Nethrius. The low-orbit plague called Brazil floats through the toxic clouds of void shields and is a long remnant of a Dark Age technology. This large floating structure shimmering with rad barriers houses the most elite of the Gilead Primus nobility, with palaces, cathedrals and mansions. 5 moons orbit this planet, and they are as follows. Anvil, an ore processor moon with megafactorums and chem plants. Scalas, the ore mine twice the size of Anvil, housing the penal complex where the inhabitants are put to work in the mines. Saints Hold, the fortified barracks moon of the Gilead Gravediggers, the system's local Imperial Guard regiment. Daedalon, a graveyard moon with billions of corpses arriving every day, housing corpse starch and servo skull manufactorums. And Imperia, a moon gilded and covered in noble mansions and palaces, housing nobility. This moon houses the palace of the long-gone Juliana Gilead herself, and also one of the largest headquarters of the Inquisition in Gilead. Charybdion. We now leave the Heartworlds and enter an area of the system known as the Reach. This area of the system is a collection of stellar debris and is home to the planet Charybdion, whose orbit marks the border between the Heartworlds and the wilds of the Reach proper. Charybdion, known as the Black Pearl of the Gilead System, is a hive world, but first and foremost an ocean world. Ragged islands and massive reef structures dot this planet, jutting out from its roiling and untamed ocean. Leviathan creatures inhabit its waters, and hive cities jut out of the rocky continental plates, spewing chemical waste. Some of these hives jut out into the skies, whereas others are built downwards into the sea and crust itself. A lot of the originally implemented promethium refineries lie on its ocean floors, some of which lie dormant, succumbed to the sea or worse. It is also here on this planet where psychers are kept in a faculty and contained. The Void Mire. We have now entered a space called the Void Mire, beyond the Heartworlds and the Reach. Claimed by the Green Steel Corsairs, this area houses fragments of broken worlds and dead ships. Xenos and Chaos threats lurk in this place that brushes up against the Cicadix Maledictum itself. A particular space hulk of note, Persephone's Regret, floats out here. This structure of dozens of void ships and stellar debris slowly floats closer to the Heartworlds, housing all kinds of ancient and current threats. We now reach the 2 membrane worlds. These 2 mysterious planets were spewed forth from the Great Rift and were pulled into the gravity well of the system's star. Volcaris. The first of these planets, Volcaris, is a death world. Inhabited by worshippers and patrons of Nurgle, the Great Unclean One, this planet that houses surprisingly breathable air houses plagues and horrors of unfathomable nightmares. Filled with millions of twisted mutants who were once Imperial citizens, demons of Nurgle, and temples and shrines dedicated to decay. A force of Death Guard make their home here. Trolleus. Trolleus orbits on the very fringes of the system star's gravity. This once immensely populated hive world has since been frozen solid in ice. Spires of hives tower into its atmosphere, and the shadowy shapes of the population frozen in ice reveals them fleeing from terror from some unforeseen threat. Those who have been brave or stupid enough to investigate the planet have reported bad dreams and nightmares, and have since been taken into the Inquisition for questioning. When this planet first appeared unexpectedly into the Gilead System, it did so in the direct path of the Ulkari craft world, creating a devastating impact. Consequently, the vessel now only half functions as a habitat. The Eldari survivors now live in a world of wraithbone and ice, occupying some of the remaining domes and facing these unnamed and unknown threats that lurk amidst the spires there. As I mentioned previously, most of the information I've accumulated for the Gilead System in general comes from the core rulebook, the Forsaken System Player's Guide, and the Wrath and Glory starter set. I have, however, compiled a list of current supplement and adventure paths that include that particular setting that might prove useful for resources or a tie-in to your campaigns. They can be seen here.